Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a text that is, well, truly iconic, globally famous, yet, as we'll see, almost completely misunderstood.
We're talking about this spiritual guidebook that most people in the West know as the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Right. And it's arguably the most famous piece of Vajrayana Buddhism, certainly in English translation.
But that fame, well, it's come at a pretty steep price. We're looking at a history that's really built on some foundational errors. Mistitling, for starters.
Huge decontextualization, too, right?
Massive. And then layers of intellectual and even countercultural appropriation over the last 100 years or so.
It's this fascinating paradox, isn't it? We think we know it. You hear the title, you think, okay, map of the afterlife, maybe instructions for a funeral. Some people even think of it as like a psychedelic manual.
Yeah, those are the common associations.
Yeah.
But our sources, the scholarship, it really confirms that this basic understanding is just flawed from the get-go.
So our mission today is to go way beyond that popular framing. We want to uncover the authentic text, its real purpose within its own tradition, which, and this is crucial, includes life, not just death.
Exactly. We need to trace its incredible journey. I mean, it's a complicated story, starting from its origins, supposedly, as a revealed text in a 14th century Tibetan mountain cave.
All the way to influencing rock music and psychology in the 20th century. It's quite a ride.
It really is. We're trying to sort of restore the whole picture today.
And we absolutely have to start, I think, with the biggest single error, what scholars often call the original sin of how it came to the West.
The title itself.
The title.
Yeah, that's the absolute entry point for understanding all the confusion that follows. That popular title, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's completely a Western invention. Marketing, basically.
Coined back in 1927, right, by the editor of the first English version, Walter Y. Evans Wentz.
That's the one. And, it wasn't just a casual mistake, like a bad translation.
No, it sounds like it was very deliberate. Calculated, even.
Absolutely. Evans Wentz was an American anthropologist, but he was also deeply involved in theosophical circles, occult studies. He had an agenda.
And the agenda was?
Commercial appeal.
Yeah.
And, a kind of intellectual legitimacy within that Western spiritual marketplace. He chose that specific title to create a direct link, a resonance, with something already hugely popular.
The Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which had been published way back in 1867 and was already a sensation. So, by calling the Tibetan text a Book of the Dead, he immediately framed it as, well, a kind of necromantic guide. Put it on the same shelf mentally for the reader.
And that framing, that title, it just instantly obscures what the text is actually for. It leads straight to decontextualization.
Completely. Because it is emphatically not a Book of the Dead. It's not a document found with a corpse or about funeral rites for the body.
It's a guide for the consciousness of the person who has died.
Precisely. A guide for the disembodied mind, you see. Versus a ritual text about the corpse. That's a fundamental distinction, and if you don't grasp that, you really can't understand the doctrine properly.
Okay, so let's ditch the misnomer. What is the real name? The authentic Tibetan title.
The actual title is Bardo Thödol, or, more formally, Bardo Thödol Chenmo.
Bardo Thödol Chenmo.
Yes. And that formal Tibetan phrase, it's incredibly technical. It's almost like an operations manual title, which, from the Nyingma tradition's perspective, is exactly what it is.
Okay, break it down for us. What's the literal translation?
It translates quite precisely as the great liberation, Grol, through hearing. Todro is in the intermediate state, Bardo.
Okay, great liberation through hearing in the intermediate state. Every single one of those words sounds important.
They are. Each one is a loaded technical term within the Buddhist framework.
Let's start with the first one, Bardo. In the West, like we said, everyone jumps to afterlife.
Yeah, and that's probably the single most widespread misconception about it. Bardo literally means between state, or intermediate state, liminal state.
So not just after death.
Not at all. It's a technical term for any gap or transition we experience between two defined conditions. It's used much more broadly in Tibetan thought.
Like what, for example?
Well, the state between falling asleep and actually dreaming, that's a bardo. Even the tiny gap between one thought ending and the next one arising is, technically speaking, a bardo.
Ah, okay. So it signifies a transition, a potent state of consciousness in between things, not just a location after you die.
Exactly. It's that transitional phase of consciousness when one clear condition has ended, but the next one hasn't quite solidified yet.
Got it. Okay, next word. Thus. That means hearing.
Yes, and this points directly to the core mechanism, the how of this particular text's power. It identifies it as a specific kind of tantric technology.
A technology based on sound.
Precisely. Because the consciousness of the person who has just died is believed to be incredibly subtle, very perceptive, almost hyper-aware, but also confused. So the text is explicitly designed to be read aloud by a lama or a spiritual friend.
Ah, so it's not meant for silent reading by the dying person beforehand.
Not primarily for that moment, no. It's meant to be recited constantly after death. The idea is that the sound itself, the vibration of the teachings being spoken, can directly impact that subtle consciousness. It cuts through the confusion, reminds the consciousness of its true nature, and hopefully catalyzes liberation.
Wow, so it's like an auditory spiritual guidance system, designed to reach the mind even when the physical senses are gone.
That's a great way to put it. And the goal of that guidance, that's the third word, grol.
Liberation.
Liberation from.
Grol refers to grol wa.
Right.
It's synonymous with enlightenment, bodhi, or nirva. It means being completely freed or sort of unraveled from the cycle of suffering, death, and rebirth, the cycle known as samsara.
Okay, so putting it all together, Bardo Thödol means?
It means, essentially, a spoken instruction set designed to achieve ultimate freedom while consciousness is navigating a state of profound transition.
That is so much more precise and frankly more interesting than the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's a world of difference, isn't it? And that precision immediately points us towards its origins, which are deeply tied to this concept of terma.
Right, terma, hidden treasure texts.
Yes. This is a really unique and fundamental aspect of the Nyingma school, which is the oldest tradition of Tibetan Buddhism.
And the traditional story is that these teachings didn't originate in the 14th century when the text was found, but much earlier.
Much earlier. The traditional account traces them back to the 8th century, to the great Indian master Padmasambhava, known in Tibet as Guru Rinpoche. He was absolutely pivotal in establishing Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet.
So why didn't he just teach it openly back then?
Well, the tradition says that Padmasambhava knew the Tibetan people of his time were ready for, basic Buddhist principles, but not yet spiritually mature enough, or perhaps the society wasn't ready, for the really profound, sometimes quite shocking tantric secrets contained in texts like the Bardo Thödol.
So he hid them.
He and his main consort, Yeshe Tsogyal, composed these texts and then deliberately concealed them.
How? Like, literally buried them?
Sometimes, yes, physically in caves, inside statues buried in sacred mountains, but also, fascinatingly, they could be concealed metaphysically within the mind stream of future disciples. Encoded, in a way.
Waiting for the right time.
Exactly. Waiting for the moment when conditions are ripe, as the tradition says, for them to be discovered and understood.
And conditions became ripe. When?
About 6 centuries later, it seems. The text we know as the Bardo Thödol was discovered or revealed in the 14th century. Specifically, sometime between 1326 and 1386.
By someone called a Turtin.
Yes, by a great Turton, which means treasure revealer. His name was Karma Lingpa. And the story goes, he was only about 15 years old when he found these texts on the slopes of Mount Gampo Dar in southern Tibet.
15! That's incredible. That time gap is huge, 8th century to the 14th. It really does make it feel like a kind of spiritual time capsule.
It does. But, we have to be intellectually honest here and acknowledge the tension.
The tension with a Western historical perspective.
Right. A modern historian, using critical methods, would likely look at this and call it pseudepigrapha. Attributing a later text to an ancient, revered figure to give it authority. It's a known phenomenon in religious history.
So the historian sees a 14th century composition, possibly incorporating older ideas, but ultimately 14th century.
While the Nyingma practitioner sees an authentic 8th century teaching, a direct transmission from Padmasambhava, revealed through Karma Lingpa in the 14th century when the world was ready.
And the key is, both can be seen as true within their own framework.
Exactly. Within the Nyingma system itself, the term of tradition isn't seen as fabrication. It's a legitimate, sacred mode of transmitting and revitalizing the Dharma through visionary revelation. We kind of have to hold both perspectives, the historical and the traditional, side by side to really get it. If you just dismiss the traditional view, you miss the source of the text's immense spiritual authority within its own culture.
Okay, that makes sense. Holding both. Now that brings us to what you called the second major error in the West's understanding, beyond the title.
Yes, the synecdoche fallacy, mistaking a part for the whole.
We assume the Bardo Thödol, the text Evans Wentz published, is a single, standalone book.
Which is completely wrong. The text he translated, and that became so famous. It's just one section, maybe 1 or 2 chapters, depending on how you count. out of a much, much larger cycle of teachings.
So by isolating it.
By isolating it, Evans Wentz and everyone who followed him based on that translation stripped the text of its essential soteriological context. That's the whole framework of practice, the path to salvation, that gives this one part its meaning.
What's the full cycle actually called, and what else is in it?
The complete textual cycle is known as the Zabcho Shitro Gompa Rangdrol.
That's a mouthful. What does it mean?
It translates roughly as the profound dharma, or teachings, of self-liberation through the intention or realization of the peaceful and wrathful ones.
Okay, even the title of the full cycle mentions self-liberation and these peaceful and wrathful ones. That already sounds like more than just an afterlife guide.
Oh, it's vast. Depending on the specific lineage or version, this cycle contains anywhere from 10 to maybe 38 distinct sections, divisions, texts.
And the Bardo Thödol, the after-death part, is just one of those.
Just one component, yes. The rest of the collection covers things like extensive daily meditation practices, visualization techniques, focusing on those peaceful and wrathful deities, ritual instructions, preliminary practices, all meant for the living practitioner.
So we basically got handed the emergency instructions from the back of the manual, without the rest of the operating instructions.
That's a perfect analogy. The entire cycle is rooted doctrinally in the Dzogchen Tantras. These are very advanced teachings focused on recognizing the pure, primordial nature of the mind right here and now. The cycle includes instructions for things like Njundro, the essential preliminary practices you have to do to even begin to approach these teachings properly.
Which makes the Bardo Thödol section, the famous bit, actually secondary in the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely secondary. It's the fail-safe instruction. That's the crucial context.
Explain that fail-safe idea more.
The larger Zabcho Shitro cycle contains the primary path. It lays out the meditations, the deity visualizations, the retreats you're supposed to do during your life to achieve enlightenment before you die. The ideal goal is to attain liberation while alive, making the Bardo Thödol instructions completely unnecessary for you.
So the text we call the Book of the Dead is really the ultimate backup plan.
It's the compassionate last-ditch effort. It's the emergency manual read to the consciousness of a practitioner who, despite doing the practices, didn't quite achieve full liberation before their physical body died.
It's the final reminder.
The final audible reminder of the very teachings they were supposed to have mastered and realized during their lifetime. So if you only read the death text, you completely miss the whole point of the life practices that were designed to make it redundant. You have to see it as part of this complete system of spiritual training.
This reframes everything. Okay, so if it's part of a larger system dealing with life and death, let's get into that system, the doctrine of the six bardos.
Exactly. And again, we have to hammer this home. Bardo is not just about the state after death. The full doctrine of the six bardos maps out the entire spectrum of conscious experience.
It's a complete cartography of consciousness.
A precise map of the journey through samsara, through conditioned existence. And crucially, fully half of this map, 3 of the 6 bardos, pertain to this life. This is the training ground.
Okay, let's walk through them. Start with the 3 natural bardos, the ones related to life.
Right. First is the Kine Bardo.
Yeah.
This is the bardo of this life. It's the ordinary waking state consciousness we're in right now. It lasts from the moment of conception until our very last breath.
And the practice associated with this bardo.
The core practice is twofold. First, deeply realizing the incredible preciousness and rarity of having a human life with the capacity for spiritual practice. Second, using that precious opportunity wisely, accumulating positive karma, understanding that your actions, your karma, are the only things that truly endure.
That feels foundational, recognizing the opportunity.
It's the absolute foundation. If you don't value this life, why would you practice? Then, from the waking state, we move into the transition states we experience every single night.
Okay, which is?
Number 2, the Milam Bardos Stupcom. This is the bardo of the dream state. That liminal state of consciousness during sleep where our ordinary identity kind of dissolves temporarily.
And the practice here is dream yoga.
Yes, dream yoga. The key practice is cultivating enough lucidity, enough clarity to recognize that you are dreaming while you are still in the dream, to see the dream's contents as illusory projections of your own mind.
And the connection to death is direct.
Incredibly direct and elegant. The logic is, if you can train your mind to recognize the dream world as unreal, as just a mental projection while you're in it, then you are building the mental muscle needed to recognize the much more intense karmic illusions and hallucinations that the texts say will arise after death.
It's like a nightly flight simulator for the afterlife.
Exactly. You're training the recognition faculty. And the third life bardo focuses on training stability.
Which is?
Number 3, the Samten Bardo. This is the bardo of meditation. It refers to the states of deep meditative absorption, the trance states known as dhyana or samadhi.
So not just casual meditation, but profound states.
Profound states, yes. The practice here is cultivating unwavering mental stability, clarity, and luminosity. It's about stabilizing the mind in its pure, clear, unconfused nature, beyond the reach of distracting thoughts.
And that stability is the prerequisite for.
It's the direct preparation for facing the ultimate reality that dawns at death. If you can maintain stability and clarity when your mind goes into deep meditation, you are far more likely to be able to recognize and hold your ground when the fundamental nature of reality, the clear light, manifests at the moment of death. It's all preparation.
So the inescapable lesson here is that this text isn't morbid at all. It's actually an urgent call to practice now while alive.
Absolutely, because the implication is clear. If you fail to train in these 3 life bardos, you're almost guaranteed to be overwhelmed by confusion and fear in the 3 death bardos.
The system provides this perfect continuity. Okay, let's briefly introduce the other 3 then. The painful bardos, the ones that are the actual subject matter of the famous Bardo Thödol text itself.
Right. These are the bardos experienced after the final breath. Number 4 is the Chikai Bardo. This is the bardo of the moment of death itself. It covers the process of physical dissolution and the first crucial opportunity, the dawning of the primary clear light.
And if that opportunity is missed,
Then consciousness enters number 5, the Chonid Bardo.
right.
This is often translated as the bardo of the experiencing of reality, or dharmata. This is described as a period, symbolically 14 days, where consciousness confronts these incredibly vivid, overwhelming visionary manifestations, the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities.
And if that is navigated incorrectly,
Then comes the final stage, number 6, the Sidpa Bardo. This is the bardo of becoming, or sometimes called the bardo of existence or transmigration. This is the state where consciousness, driven by its karma, actively seeks out a new rebirth.
it really is a cascade, isn't it? A series of diminishing opportunities for liberation. Fail the first, best chance with the clear light, you move to the visions. Fail to recognize the visions as your own mind, you're pushed towards finding a new body.
That's the structure exactly. A cascade of opportunities, each requiring a specific kind of recognition.
Okay, let's dive deep into that cascade now. We're entering the heart of the Bardo Thödol text, as it's commonly known the instructions for navigating those 3 death bardos. Start with the Chihai Bardo, the clear light opportunity.
Right, so the moment of death isn't just depicted as switching off a light. The text provides this incredibly detailed, almost clinical description of a sequential dissolution process. The physical elements that make up the body, the senses, and related mental states shut down in a specific order.
It's an ancient phenomenology of dying. Can you describe that sensory collapse?
It's quite graphic. It begins with the earth element dissolving into the water element. Physically, the body loses its solidity, its structure. The dying person might feel like they're sinking or being crushed. Sight begins to fail. The associated consciousness becomes hazy.
Then water.
Then water, representing bodily fluids and cohesion, dissolves into fire. The sense of hearing starts to fade. The body begins to lose its moisture. The mouth might feel dry. Then fire, the body's heat, dissolves into air. The sense of smell ceases. Body temperature drops significantly, starting from the extremities.
And finally, bear.
Air, the breath. Movement dissolves into consciousness itself. The breath becomes ragged, shallow, eventually ceasing at the throat. All external breathing stops. At this point, the mind is said to enter a state of profound clarity, sometimes called the inner breath or the subtle consciousness, before the final dissolution.
And it's at that absolute endpoint, the cessation of all these processes, the traditional death point, that the fundamental nature of mind is revealed.
Yes. This is the critical moment. The text says the ground luminosity, Yod Sol, the basic uncontrived nature of reality itself, is nakedly unveiled. It's described as being like a pure, empty, luminous, infinite sky. Vast, open, incredibly bright.
Brighter than the sun, some texts say.
Yes, but without the capacity to burn. It's pure, clear light. But for someone unprepared, it's also said to be intensely terrifying because it's completely beyond concepts, beyond ego.
And this is the best chance for liberation.
It is the single greatest opportunity, especially for a highly trained meditator and adept. If they stabilize their mind in the Samten Bardo, this state is somewhat familiar. They recognize this luminosity as the nature of their own mind. That recognition in that instant is immediate liberation. Attainment of the Dharmakaya, the ultimate truth body of a Buddha. No rebirth.
But the text assumes most people aren't adepts, right? What happens to the ordinary, untrained consciousness?
For the vast majority, the experience of this pure, unbound, naked reality, a reality with no reference points, no self, no concepts, is just overwhelming. It's too much. Too bright, too vast, too terrifying in its emptiness.
Oh, they recoil.
The consciousness recoils in fear or simply cannot bear the intensity, and it faints away, slips into a state of unconsciousness for a period. It misses that primary, crucial moment.
And that fainting, that failure, immediately triggers the backup plan within the Chikai Bardo itself.
Exactly. This is where that diminishing series of climaxes begins. When the consciousness eventually stirs from that faint, maybe after a short period, the secondary clear light dawns.
A less intense version.
Yes, it's described as a dimmer, less overwhelming, perhaps slightly more conceptualized version of that absolute ground luminosity. It appears in that transition moment between the deep faint and the next phase of experience.
And this is where the voice of the Lama reading the Bardo Thödol becomes absolutely critical.
Vital. The text gives specific instructions to the Lama. "O nobly born," address the deceased directly. "Recognize this secondary clear light. Hold on to it. Even though it's a lesser manifestation, liberation is still possible if the consciousness can just be reminded, coaxed into recognizing and resting in that luminosity, even for an instant."
But if both the primary and the secondary clear lights are missed, if the consciousness just remains lost in confusion or fear,
Then is plunged fully into the next phase, the often terrifying world of the Chonid Bardo.
the Bardo of experiencing reality, you said this lasts about 14 days, symbolically.
Symbolically, yes. The consciousness, having missed the direct encounter with the clear light, now awakens into a realm of incredibly vivid, complex, and often overwhelming karmic visions or hallucinations. These aren't just vague shadows. The text describes them in meticulous, often terrifying detail.
And the single most important instruction the Lama repeats throughout this phase is,
It's the anchor, the lifeline. "O nobly born, do not be terrified, do not be afraid. Recognize these appearances. Know them to be the projections of your own mind."
that's radical psychological non-dualism right there.
Absolutely. The core message is these terrifying deities, these blissful visions, they are not external supernatural beings attacking or rewarding you. They are the literal, immediate, spontaneous manifestation of your own mind's karmic traces, your own deepest psychological patterns, your thought forms. They are a reflection of your own interior reality.
And if you recognize them as such,
Recognition equals liberation. If you see them as your own mind, they dissolve. But if you react with fear and aversion to the terrifying ones, or with craving and attachment to the peaceful, beautiful ones,
you solidify them.
you solidify their apparent reality, you get caught by them, and that reaction itself binds the consciousness further and impels it towards a negative rebirth. It's the reaction, the failure to recognize, that's the problem.
And these visions unfold in a very specific sequence, don't they? This symbolic 14-day mandala structure.
Yes, very precise. The first 7 days are dominated by the appearance of the 42 peaceful deities, Jibalazanyes. These are the initial manifestations, often appearing in brilliant, dazzling colors, accompanied by gentle sounds.
Who are they, symbolically?
They represent the fundamental, pure, enlightened architecture of the psyche. They include figures like the primordial Buddha Samantabhadra and his consort, and crucially, the 5 Buddha families. Each of these 5 families, Buddha, Vajra, Ratna, Padma, Karma, is linked to one of the 5 psychophysical aggregates, or skandhas like form, feeling, perception, volition, consciousness, and also to one of the 5 elements. They appear along with their consorts and attendant bodhisattvas. They represent the inherent purity of your own mind's components.
It sounds beautiful, but potentially still overwhelming.
Oh, definitely.
Mhm.
Even these peaceful forms can be terrifying if the consciousness is still clinging to its ego and doesn't recognize them as its own innate wisdom. And if it fails that recognition, if it recoils even from these peaceful, luminous forms,
Then the energy completely shifts.
dramatically. Days 8 through 14 bring the dawning of the 58 wrathful deities, Krupui Luglinga Buja Brigad. And this is the part that often shocks Western readers the most.
Because these aren't different beings, are they?
No, that's the crucial point. They are the very same enlightened energies, the same principles as the peaceful deities, but now appearing in their dynamic, terrifying, transformative Haruka aspect. It's like the flip side of the coin.
Give us a sense of the imagery. How terrifying are we talking?
The descriptions are intense. These figures are huge, monstrous, multi-headed, multi-limbed, often depicted blazing with wisdom fires, adorned with garlands of human skulls or severed heads, wearing flayed human or animal skins, drinking blood from skull cups. They emit deafening, terrifying sounds like thunder or howling, meant to shatter ego clinging.
Who are some of these figures?
You encounter the 5 great wrathful Harukas, who are the terrifying counterparts of the 5 peaceful Dhyani Buddhas, and various entourages of fierce female deities like the animal-headed Traman goddesses, figures with lion heads, tiger heads, snake heads, crow heads, embodying untamed natural energies.
The imagery seems designed to provoke maximum fear, to break through denial.
Exactly. The peaceful deities represent the gentle invitation to recognize your pure nature. The wrathful deities are like a form of spiritual shock therapy. They represent the raw, dynamic, untamed energy of enlightenment itself, which appears terrifying, only to an ego that resists it.
So the entire mandala, the 100 deities in total, 42 peaceful plus 58 wrathful, is a complete map.
A complete, profound psychological map. The peaceful are the inherent structure, the potential. The wrathful are the active energy, the power. They are 2 sides of the same reality. The fear they evoke isn't inherent in them. It arises from the consciousness's own ignorance and karmic obscurations. Failure to recognize and integrate this total reality, both peaceful and wrathful aspects of mind, means the consciousness is still caught.
And that failure leads inevitably to the final stage.
Yes, to the Sidpa Bardo, the Bardo of becoming or transmigration. The consciousness has now missed all the direct opportunities for liberation based on recognizing its own nature, clear light, or its own projections, deities.
So what's its state now?
It's completely adrift, feeling lost, propelled helplessly by the winds of karma, the accumulated force of past actions. It finds itself possessing a subtle mental body, heedless.
A mental body, like a ghost.
Sort of, but with specific characteristics. It's not physical, but it has heightened, almost supernormal senses. And crucially, it possesses unimpeded motion. It can travel anywhere instantly just by thinking of it passing through walls, mountains, anything solid.
That sounds kind of freeing in a way.
You'd think so, but the texts emphasize that it's actually a state of great torment and misery. Despite the ability to go anywhere, the consciousness feels rootless, disembodied, and experiences constant, terrifying, karmically driven hallucinations, storms, darkness, predatory beasts, frightening noises.
And it might revisit familiar places.
Yes, that's a common theme. It might return to its former home, see its family mourning, try desperately to communicate, but realizes it cannot be seen or heard. This causes immense frustration and suffering. It sees its own corpse being prepared for disposal, deepening the realization that it's truly dead.
And this state of confusion and suffering leads eventually to the famous judgment scene. This seems paradoxical in Buddhism.
It is deeply paradoxical because Buddhism is fundamentally non-theistic. It's based on impersonal cause and effect karma, not on a judging God. Yet here in the Sidpa Bardo, the deceased consciousness is described as appearing before Yama, the Lord of Death, who is also called the Dharma Raja, the King of Truth or Justice.
So how do we square this? If the whole system is about recognizing projections of your own mind, how should we understand Yama and this judgment?
The commentary emphasizes that this scene must be understood symbolically, psychologically. Yama is not an external deity passing sentence from on high. He holds up the mirror of karma.
The mirror doesn't judge, it just reflects.
Exactly. The mirror simply, clearly, and inescapable reflects every single good and evil action, even the subtlest thoughts, performed by the deceased during their lifetime. This is the profound life review phenomenon that's so commonly reported in modern near-death experience research. The consciousness sees its entire life flash before it, with total clarity about the impact of its actions.
What about the weighing of the white and black pebbles?
That's part of the symbolic drama. The texts describe attendant figures, sometimes called the white god and black god, placing white pebbles for good deeds and black pebbles for evil deeds onto a scale. Again, this isn't a literal weighing by external agents, but a dramatization of the impersonal, inevitable balancing out of one's own karmic account. The weight of one's own actions determines the outcome.
And Yama himself is also a projection.
Yes. Critically, Yama is often identified in commentaries as being, in essence, a wrathful manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezig in Tibetan, the bodhisattva of compassion. or sometimes as a projection of the deceased's own conscience, their own internal awareness of the truth of their actions. The judgment is inescapable because it comes from within, from the karmic reality one has created for oneself.
Okay, so the judgment is the facing of one's own karma, and the outcome of that karmic balance then propels the consciousness towards rebirth.
Inexorably, yes. Towards rebirth in one of the 6 realms of samsara, gods, demigods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, or hell beings. The specific realm is determined by the predominant remaining karmic tendencies, particularly patterns of attraction and aversion.
How does that final selection happen?
The mental body, driven by its karma, starts to see visions associated with the different realms. Crucially, it sees visions of couples mating. Depending on its past karmic conditioning, it feels intense attraction or aversion towards these scenes.
And that feeling determines the rebirth.
Yes. For example, feeling strong attraction towards the female figure and aversion to the male might lead to rebirth as a male in that particular realm, and vice versa. This is the point Carl Jung famously noted as having parallels with the Oedipus complex, the idea of primal attractions and repulsions driving destiny. Getting drawn into one of these visions is what locks the consciousness into its next specific birth.
It sounds like the absolute final, desperate moment. Does the text still offer any advice here?
Amazingly, yes. Even at this 11th hour, as the consciousness is being pulled towards a womb, the Bardo Thödol provides last-minute escape instructions.
Like what?
Things like trying to block the entrance to the womb through intense visualization, perhaps visualizing a protective deity, or meditating fiercely on emptiness to dissolve the attraction. Or, if blocking rebirth seems impossible, instructions on how to consciously choose a favorable rebirth specifically, a human rebirth, in a place where one can encounter the Dharma again and continue practicing. The guidance continues right up to the very threshold of the next life.
That comprehensive care is just astounding. Okay, we've traced the journey. Now let's ground this. How is this text actually used in practice? Because its function is fundamentally ritualistic.
Absolutely crucial point. This is not a book you just hand someone to read silently on their deathbed. It's a script for a performance. A ritual performance that's vocal, often public or semi-public, and deeply social.
Performed by whom?
Ideally by a qualified lama or monk, or at least a knowledgeable spiritual friend, Kalyamitra, who understands the teachings. They must recite the text aloud, clearly and continuously, near the body of the deceased.
And this goes on for a while.
Yes, the recitation ideally continues for the entire symbolic duration of the Bardo state, which is traditionally said to be up to 49 days.
49 days. Why that specific period?
That's considered the maximum time the consciousness might remain in the intermediate state before being definitively propelled into its next rebirth. So the ritual provides this continuous, audible support system throughout that entire critical period.
And the tone is very direct.
Very direct, very intimate. The Lama addresses the deceased by name. O nobly born, So Nam Wang Du, or whoever. Listen without distraction. The time has come for you to seek the path. The clear light is dawning. Recognize it. This constant, personalized, auditory repetition, as the title implies, is the core technology using sound to cut through the deceased's likely state of confusion, fear, and disorientation.
Liberation through hearing. It really is like a spiritual GPS, using sound waves to guide a consciousness that's lost its physical bearings.
That's a perfect way to think about it. And while the ritual is directly addressed to the deceased, we have to remember the text is also, perhaps even primarily, a manual for the living.
How so?
Well, the primary audience, in a sense, is the living practitioner who studies this text throughout their life. They learn the map, they familiarize themselves with the stages, the deities, the instructions, so that when their own death process begins, they might be able to recall the teachings and navigate the bardos consciously from the inside.
Makes sense. Prepare beforehand. But the ritual itself, the act of reciting it for someone else, that must have a profound impact on the survivors too.
Immense. It serves a critical therapeutic function for managing grief within the Tibetan cultural context. It's not passive mourning.
It gives them something active to do.
Exactly. By sponsoring the ritual, by participating, by maintaining the recitation, the family and community are actively doing something beneficial for the departed. They are channeling their feelings of love, attachment, and grief into concrete actions believed to support the deceased's journey towards a good rebirth or even liberation. This provides a structure, a sense of purpose, and helps maintain what anthropologists call a continuing bond with the departed, but in a healthy, functional, spiritual way.
That sounds much more integrated than just, say, attending a funeral and then being left alone with grief.
It's very integrated, and this formal doctrinal teaching is also powerfully reinforced in popular Tibetan culture through something called the D-log tradition.
D-log, what's that?
D-logs are people, often lay individuals, sometimes women, who claim to have died, journeyed through the Bardo states, witnessed the judgment, seen the heavens and hells, and then returned to life to recount their experiences. They are like Bardo travelers, storytellers.
Wow, so their stories spread these ideas widely.
Immensely. While the formal Bardo Thödol text focuses heavily on the potential for liberation through recognition, the D-log tales often emphasize the more terrifying aspects, the consequences of negative karma, the horrors of the hell realms, the severity of Yama's judgment.
So they function as potent cautionary tales for the community.
Precisely. They powerfully reinforce the ethical teachings, the importance of practicing virtue now, in this life, to avoid those post-mortem terrors. They underscore the urgency of the life bardos we talked about.
Okay, so we have the ritual use, the preparation use, the grief function, the popular reinforcement. This brings us to the really fascinating modern applications, doesn't it? Particularly in end-of-life care.
Yes, in modern thanatology, the study of death and dying, and especially within the hospice movement, people are now seriously looking at the Bardo Thödol. Not necessarily for its metaphysics, but for its incredibly detailed phenomenology of agony, its description of the dying process.
Some clinicians even see it as a kind of human protocol model for reading the signs of impending death.
Exactly. Remember that detailed sequence of the elements dissolving we discussed? Earth into water, water into fire, and so on. Clinicians working in palliative care have found remarkable correlations between those ancient descriptions and specific, observable clinical signs that reliably predict impending death.
Can you connect those again? The elements and the clinical signs?
Sure. So the dissolution of earth, stability, form, sight, often correlates with observable physical changes like the loss of ability to hold the head up, changes in facial structure, or failing eyesight. The dissolution of water, fluids, hearing, often correlates with the cessation of bodily secretions, like saliva drying up, or critically, the interruption of diuresis urine output stopping.
And fire and air.
Fire dissolving into air, heat, smell fading, correlates with the palpable cooling of the body, starting peripherally, and changes in smell perception. And finally, air dissolving into consciousness, breath, movement stopping, correlates directly with observable changes in breathing patterns.
What kind of breathing patterns?
Hospice professionals using this model note a sequence, maybe a shift from normal nasal breathing to more labored mouth breathing, which might indicate weeks remaining, then progressing to irregular, perhaps diaphragmatic breathing, maybe days remaining, then very shallow chest breathing, perhaps hours. And finally, the complete cessation of external breath marks the dissolution of the air element. They also look at pulse quality, the emptiness of the pulse corresponding to life force receding, and that interruption of diuresis, often seen as a sign death is imminent within hours.
That level of detailed observation codified centuries ago is just astonishing. But it's more than just clinical data, isn't it? It provides something for the families.
Oh, absolutely. For families, especially in secular Western cultures where death is often medicalized and hidden away, the process can be terrifyingly opaque, meaningless. The Bardo Thödol, even if only partially understood, can help provide a framework of meaning.
It gives them reference points.
Yes. Tangible signs to look for, expectations for what might be happening physically and even subjectively for their loved one. This can reduce fear, allow for more meaningful communication, help families engage in functional ways saying goodbye, expressing love rather than feeling helpless bystanders to a purely clinical event. It helps them find the strength and the appropriate timing for closure.
And finally, we have to mention its huge importance for near-death experience research, NDEs.
Foundational, really. The Bardo Thödol is probably the most detailed, ancient literary source we have that describes experiences strikingly similar to modern NDE reports.
What are the key parallels?
So many. The feeling of leaving the physical body, the mental body. The journey through a dark space or tunnel towards a brilliant light, the clear light. Encounters with beings of light, sometimes perceived as deities or religious figures, the peaceful deities, sometimes terrifying visions or hellish landscapes, the wrathful deities or lower realms, and of course that panoramic life review, often in the presence of a being of light, the mirror of karma before Yama. The text provides this incredibly rich, pre-existing religious framework for phenomena that modern science is still struggling to understand.
It's an amazing bridge between ancient wisdom and modern investigation. Okay, this feels like the right place to pivot. We've seen the text in its original context, its practice. Now let's trace its second life, its journey into the West, which, as you said at the start, is a story full of, well, issues.
Appropriation, distortion, misrepresentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's complex. And it really starts with that 1927 Evans-Wentz translation. The theosophical filter, you could call it?
Right. Evans-Wentz. Never went to Tibet, didn't speak Tibetan fluently, relied heavily on translations done by others.
And he wasn't just a neutral compiler or editor. He was deeply immersed in the worldview of late 19th, early 20th century theosophy, people like Madame Blavatsky, Annie Besant. This whole movement trying to find a universal, ancient wisdom underlying all religions.
Often with a strong leaning towards certain interpretations of Hinduism, right? Neo-Vedanta.
Exactly. So his 1927 publication, which he called a compilation and editing, was far from a faithful rendering of Nyingma Tibetan Buddhism. He openly admitted he filled in the missing parts he thought were missing or unclear with his own interpretations, often drawn from theosophy or Hinduism.
So he was trying to make it fit his pre-existing ideas.
Pretty much. He tried to harmonize it, inserting concepts of reincarnation, karma, and the afterlife that aligned better with theosophical beliefs, sometimes smoothing over or ignoring doctrines specific to Tantric Buddhism that didn't quite fit or that he didn't understand.
And he added a ton of footnotes, too.
Hundreds. Extensive notes and commentary, supposedly to make the text more intelligible to a Western audience, but really, they filter the text through his own theosophical lens. He essentially created this new, hybrid, synthetic presentation.
And that version, that single biased publication, became the foundation for almost everything that followed in the West.
For decades, yes, it was the source. So for generations, Westerners were accessing what they thought was pure Tibetan Buddhism, but it was actually Tibetan Buddhism seen through this distorting filter of early 20th century occultism and comparative religion. That initial framing, that bias, set the stage for all the subsequent appropriations.
Yeah. And the first major intellectual figure to really engage with it and amplify its influence was Carl Jung.
Yes, in 1935, Jung wrote his famous psychological commentary, which was included in later editions of the Evans-Wentz translation. This was huge. It gave the text immense credibility in intellectual and psychological circles.
Jung loved the text, didn't he? Called it his constant companion.
He did. He said he owed it many fundamental insights. He saw it not as a literal guide to the afterlife, but as a perfect symbolic map of the psyche's journey towards wholeness, what he called the process of individuation.
And he created this really elegant mapping between the Bardo stages and his psychological model.
Very elegant, very compelling. He basically took the Sipa Bardo, the Bardo of rebirth and becoming, with its karmic drives and visions of mating couples, and mapped that onto the personal unconscious, the repository of our individual complexes, desires, shadow aspects.
And the Choni di Bardo with all the deities.
That, for Jung, was a stunning illustration of the collective unconscious. Those 100 peaceful and wrathful deities. They were perfect examples of his archetypes, universal patterns of the psyche appearing in both their benevolent integrated forms, peaceful, and their terrifying shadow or transformative forms, wrathful.
A blueprint of the deep psyche and the ultimate moment, the clear light in the Chikai Bardo.
Jung mapped that onto the transcendent self, the ultimate center and goal of individuation. The clear light, for Jung, represented the state of total realization, the integration of conscious and unconscious, the achievement of psychological wholeness.
It's a powerful reading. It made the text incredibly relevant and accessible to Westerners interested in psychology, but it also performed a kind of transformation on the text itself.
A fundamental transformation. This is the critical point. Traditional Tibetan Buddhism, especially Dzogchen, emphasizes anatta, the doctrine of no self, or not self. The ultimate goal is liberation from the structures of the psyche, realizing their emptiness, escaping the cycle of suffering driven by ego clinging.
Whereas Jung's psychology is all about integrating and strengthening the self, the ego, in relation to the unconscious.
Exactly. Jung puts the individual psyche, the self, right at the center. So the goal shifts entirely, from Buddhist liberation from the psyche to Jungian integration of the psyche. It's a profound interpretation, hugely influential, but it's fundamentally different from, arguably even opposed to, the original Buddhist soteriological aim. He made the text about finding the self, when the text's purpose was to help you lose the self or realize its lack of inherent existence.
That psychological reframing, however unintentional, really opened the door for the next major appropriation, didn't it? The most perhaps culturally widespread one.
Oh, absolutely. The Psychonaut's Guide. In 1964, Timothy Leary, Ralph Messner, and Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass, published their book, The Psychedelic Experience. a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
This was taking Jung's psychological reading and just running with it, applying it directly to drug experiences.
Literally, it was the ultimate act of cultural re-engineering or perhaps desacralization, depending on your view. They took the structure of the Bardo Thödol, as interpreted by Evans, Wentz, and Jung, and explicitly restructured it as a step-by-step manual for guiding an LSD trip.
Mapping the Bardo states onto the phases of a psychedelic session.
Precisely. They talked about achieving ego death during the trip, mirroring the dissolution process. The Jikai Bardo, the clear light moment, that became the peak experience of the trip, described as a state of pure awareness, void, or orgastic creativity.
And the visions.
The Chonid Bardo, with the peaceful and wrathful deities, that mapped onto the period of intense psychedelic visions and hallucinations, sometimes blissful, sometimes terrifying. Hell hallucinations, they call them.
And the Sidpa Bardo, the drive towards rebirth.
They reframed that completely. It wasn't about seeking a physical womb. It became the period of re-entry. The challenge was to navigate the return from the peak experience back into ordinary consciousness, or game reality as they called it, hopefully integrating the insights and returning as a wiser, more enlightened person.
This book was massive, wasn't it? Culturally.
Huge. It became a foundational text for the 1960s counterculture. It gave a kind of spiritual or psychological legitimacy to the psychedelic experience, and it directly influenced art, music. Most famously, John Lennon read it and used lines directly inspired by it for the Beatles track Tomorrow Never Knows.
Turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream.
That's a direct paraphrase of instructions from the Leary Manual, which itself was paraphrasing and reinterpreting the Bardo Thödol. It cemented the book's fame for millions, but in this completely altered form.
It seems like the ultimate removal from the original context.
Absolutely. By framing the Bardo states as merely stages of a temporary, drug-induced ego death, they completely severed the text from its essential Buddhist foundation, its ethical system, the doctrine of karma, the goal of liberation from samsara over lifetimes. It became a purely psychological, experiential guidebook detached from its religious roots. And that version is arguably the one that most people in popular culture vaguely associate with the title Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Which brings us, thankfully, to the more recent scholarly reckoning. The pushback against these appropriations, people like Donald S. Lopez Jr.
Yes, Lopez has been a leading voice in critically examining how the West has constructed its image of Tibetan Buddhism. His work, and that of others, really critiques this whole Western construct of the Tibetan Book of the Dead as being largely a fantasy, a misrepresentation.
He argues the West basically saw what it wanted to see.
Pretty much. He famously wrote that when the West looked at Tibet, particularly through texts like this one filtered by Evans, Wentz, and Jung, all that it has seen is a distorted reflection of itself. We projected our own desires, anxieties, and intellectual frameworks onto it.
And he's critiqued later translations, too, hasn't he, for continuing in subtle ways to try and make the text fit Western expectations.
Yeah. He pointed out examples even in more modern popular translations, attempts to translate traditional Tibetan terms in ways that make them sound more familiar or acceptable to a modern, secular, scientific mindset, like translating Vijayatara, a kind of tantric adept or knowledge holder, as a hero scientist.
We're translating karma simply as evolution.
Exactly. These choices, while perhaps well-intentioned to make the text accessible, can end up domesticating it, stripping it of its specific, sometimes challenging, cultural and religious context. They continue the project of making it fit our worldview, rather than presenting it on its own terms.
But this critical scholarship has also led to much better, more complete translations finally emerging, restoring the context Evans Wentz stripped away.
Thankfully, yes. The sources consistently point to the 2005 translation, edited by Yerma Dorje, with introductory commentary by the Dalai Lama, as a major turning point.
Why was that one so significant?
Because it was the first widely available scholarly English translation that presented the entire relevant cycle, all 12 chapters, or however you divide them, of the original Zabcho Shitro Gumpa Rangdrol cycle that the Bardo Thödol actually belongs to. It finally put the Book of the Dead section back into its proper, vast literary and doctrinal home. It moved decisively beyond the selective, filtered, decontextualized version the West had been working with for nearly 80 years.
So after this whole journey, tracing the text from Tibet to the West and back again through scholarship, it seems clear we're dealing with two different things now.
That's the inescapable conclusion, isn't it? Two distinct Tibetan Books of the Dead effectively exist in the world today.
Describe them one last time.
Okay. On the one hand, you have the Bardo Thödol itself, the precise, technical 14th century Nyingma Terma text revealed by Karma Lingpa. It's a relatively small but vital part of the larger Zabsho Shitro cycle. Its purpose is purely ritualistic and soteriological, a fail-safe guide using the technology of liberation through hearing to navigate the consciousness of a recently deceased practitioner through the 49-day intermediate state towards liberation or a favorable rebirth. That's Book 1.
And Book 2?
Book 2 is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Western cultural construct. It was birthed from Evans Wentz's selective translation and theosophical framing. It was then given immense intellectual weight and psychological legitimacy by Carl Jung, who saw it as a universal map of the archetypal psyche. And finally, it was popularized and, you could say, secularized by Timothy Leary and the counterculture as a manual for navigating psychedelic experiences.
So true understanding requires recognizing both.
I think it does. You have to hold both in view simultaneously. One is a document of a specific, profound, ancient religious practice aimed at ending the suffering of rebirth. The other is a fascinating mirror, reflecting a century of Western spiritual searching, psychological theorizing, and cultural change.
It really makes you think about what happens to a sacred text when it travels across cultures. It's not static. It gets transformed by every lens that views it. We have to be so aware of the lens we're using.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if we circle back to the authentic doctrine for a final thought, if we take seriously the idea that those three life bardos, waking, dream, and meditation, are the only real preparation, the only training ground for navigating the three death bardos.
It poses a pretty radical challenge for us right now.
It really does. A challenge for you, the listener, to consider today. If the only way to face the potential terror and confusion of the clear light and the deity visions after death is to have already cultivated the ability to recognize the illusory nature of this current reality, to see waking life as dreamlike, as the Dream Bardo practice teaches, how does that knowledge fundamentally change how you engage with your own consciousness, your own experience, right now in this Kine Bardo, the Bardo of this life?
That's the provocative thought to leave people with. The text suggests the ultimate preparation for death is radical awareness in life.
The Bardo Thödol essentially says, the only way to avoid being terrified by the projections of your own mind in the afterlife is to recognize them as projections of your own mind while you are still living. That perhaps is the deepest meaning of the great liberation through hearing.